Chapter 1 of the Pianoforte Sonata by John South Shedlock. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Introductory. In history we find certain names associated with great movements. Luther with the Reformation or Garibaldi with the liberation of Italy. Luther certainly posted on the door of the church at Wittenberg his famous theses, and burnt the papal bull at the gates of that city, yet before Luther there lived men, such as the scholar Erasmus, who have been appropriately named reformers before the Reformation. So, too, Cavour's cautious policy paved the way for Garibaldi's brilliant victories. Once again Leonardo da Vinci is named as the inventor of chiaroscuro, yet he was preceded by Fra Filippo Lippi, and in similar manner in music certain men are associated with certain forms. Haydn, for example, is called the father of the quartet. Close investigation, however, would show that he is only a link, and certainly not the first one in a long evolution. So, too, with the sonata. The present volume is, however, specially concerned with the clavier or pianoforte sonata, and for that we have a convenient starting point. The sonata in B flat of Kuhnau, published in 1695. The date is easy to remember, for in that same year died England's greatest musician, Henry Purcell. Before studying the history of the pianoforte sonata, even in outline, it is essential that something should be said about the early history of the sonata. That term appears first to have been used in contradistinction to cantata. The one was a piece sounded, suonata from sonando, by instruments, the other one sung by voices. The form of these early sonatas, as they appear in Giovanni Gabrieli's work towards the end of the 16th century, was vague, yet, in spite of light imitations, the basis was harmonic rather than contrapuntal. They were among the first fruits of the Renaissance in Italy, but soon there came about a process of differentiation. Praetorius, in his Syntagma Musicum, published at Wolfenbüttel in 1619, distinguishes between the sonata and the canzona. Speaking generally, from one seems to have come the sonata proper, from the other the suite. During the whole of the 18th century there was a continual intercrossing of these two species. It is no easy matter, therefore, to trace the early stages of development of each separately. Marburg, in his description of various kinds of pieces in his Klavierstücke, published at Berlin in 1762, says sonatas are pieces in 3 or 4 movements, marked merely allegro, adagio, presto, etc., although in character they may be really an allemande, courante and gigue. Corelli, as will be mentioned later on, gave dance titles in addition to allegro, adagio, etc. Marburg also states that when the middle movement is in slow time it is not always in the key of the first and last movements. This again shows intercrossing. The genuine suite consists of several dance movements, allemande, courante, sarabande, gigue, all in the same key. But we find occasionally in suites a fugue or fuguetta, or even an aria or adagio, and in name, at any rate, one dance movement has formed part of the sonata since the time of Emanuel Bach. In 1611 Banchieri, an Olivetan monk, published at Venice his L'organo suonerino, a work useful and necessary to organists, thus runs the title page. At the end of the volume there are some pieces, vocal and instrumental, a concerto for soprano or tenor, with organ, a fantastica, ricercata, etc., among which are to be found 2 sonatas, one entitled Prima Sonata, doppio soggetto, the other Seconda Sonata, soggetto triplicato. They are written out in open score of 4 staves, with mezzo-soprano, alto, tenor and bass clefs. To show how the sonatas of those days differed both in form and content from the sonata of our century, the first of the above mentioned is given in short score. It will, probably, remind readers of the first, i.e. sonatas, that my, i.e. Dr. Burney, musical inquiries have discovered, namely, some sonatas by Francesco Torini, which consisted of only a single movement in fugue and imitation throughout. Torini was organist of Brescia Cathedral and in 1624 published Madrigali a una, due, tre voci con alcune sonate e a tre, Venice 1624. Between Torini, also Carlo Farina, who published violin sonatas at Dresden in 1628, and Corelli, born 1653, who brought out his first work in 1683, one name of great importance is Giovanni Legrenzi. In the 8th volume of Dr. Burney's musical extracts there are two sonatas, a tre a due violini e violone by Legrenzi, opera ottava, 1677. The first is in B flat. It commences with a movement in common time entitled La Benivoglia. An adagio in G minor, only 6 bars, is followed by an allegro in D minor, 6/8 time, closing on a major chord, then 8 bars common time in B flat, no heading, and finally a presto, 3/4, commencing in G minor and closing in B flat. None of the movements is in binary form. The second sonata in D has 5 short movements. Number 1 has an opening of 37 bars in common time, fugato. There is a modulation in the 9th bar to the dominant and, later on, a return to the opening theme and key. In the intervening space, however, in spite of modulation, the principal key is not altogether avoided. Sonatas of various kinds by Legrenzi appeared between 1655 and 1677. Then there were the Vari fiori del giardino musicale uero sonate da camera, etc. of Giovanni Maria Bononcini, father of Battista Bononcini, the famous rival of Handel, published at Bologna in 1669, and the sonatas of Giovanni Battista Vitali, Bologna 1677. Giambattista Bassani of Bologna, although his junior by birth, was the violin master of the great Corelli. His sonatas only appeared after those of his illustrious pupil, yet may have been composed before. Of the 12 in opus 5, most have many short movements, some indeed are so short as to be scarcely deserving of the name. By the time of Arcangelo Corelli, who, as mentioned, published his first work, opus 1, 12 sonatas for 2 violins and a bass, in 1683, sonatas answered to the definition given by Mattheson in his Das neue Offenete Orchester, 1713, in which they are said to consist of alternate adagio and allegro. G. J. Walther again in his Dictionary of Music, which appeared in Leipzig in 1732, describes a sonata as a grave artistic composition for instruments, especially violins. The idea of grouping movements was already in vogue in the 16th century. Morley in his Plain and Easy Introduction to Practical Music, published in 1597, speaks of the desirableness of alternating pavans and galliards, the one being a kind of staid music ordained for grave dancing and the other a lighter and more stirring kind of dancing. Contrast was obtained, too, not only by difference in the character, but also in the measure of the music. The former was in common, the latter in triple time. With regard to the grouping of movements, Corelli's sonatas show several varieties.